Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, which is one of the most important ethical theories out there, and you need to know about it. In order to introduce utilitarianism, however, we're going to first talk about what is often called the ticking time bomb scenario. And there are different versions of it, so we're just going to tell our own version of it in the context of this course, and hopefully many of you will use this as a jumping off point for a reflection assignment. So let's imagine that a terrorist has set a nuclear bomb in Philadelphia, and it's set to go off in, let's say, 12 hours. So it's going to go off in like 12 hours, and it's going to destroy the city of Philadelphia. And let's say that the government knows without a doubt, don't ask how, that somebody in our class has set the device, but they don't know who. So here's the question. 12 hours till this bomb goes off. Everybody in Philadelphia is going to die except for our class. So we're somehow going to be miraculously protected either way. Okay, so we're going to be fine either way. But the question is, would it be morally permissible for the government to round all of us up, to find every member of our class, since they have infallible evidence that it is somebody in our class, they just don't know which of us has set the bomb? Would it be okay for them to round all of us up and to just torture all of us, knowing that everybody but one person in our class is completely innocent? Would it be permissible to torture all of us in order to try to stop the bomb? What do you think? All right, so I'm actually going to make a break here in the video. So I want you to actually think about that. So bomb's going to go off. It's going to kill however many 6 million people in Philadelphia, except for us, right? We'll be miraculously protected by the prayers of the nuns, let's say. There you go. So we'll be fine. But would it be permissible for them to round all of us up and to torture all of us, knowing that all of us but one is completely guilty, in order to have the chance to stop this bomb from going off? All right, so take a couple minutes and think about that. What do you think? Would it be permissible or not? So I hope you all actually took a couple minutes to think about that. So I'm curious what you think. Do you think that it would be morally permissible for the government to round us all up and to torture all of us, even though all but one of us is completely innocent? So if you're thinking about this question in terms of A, the potential consequences of torturing people or not torturing people, and B, the number of people that might suffer or be saved by being tortured, then you're already thinking like a utilitarian. Yeah, utilitarians are all about cost-benefit analysis. That's what they do. They try to figure out what the cost of an action will be and what the benefits of an action might be, and they try to maximize the benefits while decreasing the costs as much as possible. That's what they do, right? So that's if that's how you're thinking about it. If you're thinking like, oh yeah, I think it would be okay to torture people because it's like whatever. There's like 20 of us and there's like 6 million people, so it would be okay for 20 people to suffer if it saves the lives of 6 million people. You're already thinking like a utilitarian. So what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that maintains that an action is morally right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected. I'm going to repeat that and change it slightly. What I said is accurate, but I'm going to broaden it a little bit. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory that maintains that an action or a rule, law, policy, and so on is morally right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected. Because utilitarians won't just talk about actions. We're talking about here, would it be okay to torture? That's an action. But they also talk about policies, laws, this kind of stuff, rules. So they can talk at the level of an individual choice or as like a general policy, right? So I gave you a specific scenario, ticking time bomb scenario, and I asked, would it be okay to torture in this particular scenario? But utilitarians can also broaden that and ask the question, is it like ever okay to torture in a terrorist situation? That would be a kind of like a rule or a policy kind of question. And utilitarians will have the same way of answering those questions as well, which is to say they will do a kind of cost-benefit analysis and try to minimize the costs and try to maximize the benefits. That's how they think. Okay? And so they'll say, of the various options that we have, the action or law, policy, whatever, the one that minimizes costs and maximizes benefits the best, the one that is most successful in doing that, that is the moral choice, right? So if you have 3 different actions available to you, you find the one that maximizes the happiness of everybody who's affected, which is to say that has the smallest cost and the greatest benefit. All right? So let's dig into utilitarianism a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about 4 things in this video. First, we're going to talk about the John Stuart Mill, who is the central figure in utilitarianism nowadays. There's also a guy by the name of Jeremy Bentham, who's extraordinarily influential. But nowadays, when philosophers tend to talk about utilitarianism, they tend to talk about John Stuart Mill. And then second, we're going to talk about the goal of utilitarianism. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about the method of utilitarianism. How do utilitarians determine what's moral and what's not? And then lastly, we're going to talk about objections to utilitarianism. We're going to talk about 2 objections to utilitarianism. All right, so let's dig into it. Well, we're going to skip Jeremy Bentham, and we're just going to focus on John Stuart Mill. I know a lot of people would be upset by that. There's some philosophers out there who are like diehard Jeremy Bentham fans. He's an interesting character. You can actually still see him. I mean, he lived back in the 17 and 1800s, but you can actually go see him because he donated his body to science, and he is now stuffed in a museum in England. I am not even joking. I'm like tempted to put the picture up in the video. I won't do that because it is a straight up nightmare fuel. They turned him into a body, what is it called? A body icon, something icon, auto icon. That's what it is, an auto icon. They turned him into an auto icon. But when they tried to mummify his head, they messed up, and his head is just straight up, as I say, it's straight up nightmare fuel. So you can Google it on your own time. You can go see him. It's like, wait till around Halloween, and you can go freak yourself out and go to England. His head was actually stolen at one point. Why am I telling you this? Because it's interesting. That's why. His head was stolen by a group of undergraduates at one point, and now they keep his head under lock and key. Ridiculous. I think Bentham would think it's funny, actually. He was an interesting person himself. In any case, we're going to focus on John Stuart Mill. Johnny boy. All right, so who was John Stuart Mill? He was a famous philosopher, also politician. He actually served as a politician for, I think, 1 term in the House of Commons, I believe, in England. But he was a philosopher predominantly. He was born in 1806 and lived until 1873. His influence is huge. It's hard to overstate. He's one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century easily. So he had a monumental impact on the way that we think about the natural sciences, the way that we think about logic, government, and most importantly, of course, for our purposes, how we think about ethics. So he did not invent the ethical tradition known as utilitarianism, but he is, I think, its most famous defender. 3 of his most important ethical and political works are On Liberty, 1859. So On Liberty is a wonderful work of classical liberalism. He is a classical liberal. He likes individual freedoms. He offers there one of the most robust defenses of free speech, actually, in that book. Highly recommend you read that book. It's really, really interesting. Many of you are probably influenced by that book, even if you don't realize that you are, because in that book, he articulates something that's called the harm principle. We're going to come back to that later. Secondly, he wrote a book called Utilitarianism. That was published in 1861, which, of course, is what we're going to be talking about predominantly today. And then he wrote a book called On the Subjection of Women, which was published in 1863. That sounds like it should be published in 1963, but he was a little bit ahead of his time. So he published a work called On the Subjection of Women. He published more than just those works. He published, as I say, on perception, on logic, lots of different kinds of things. He was an interesting person. He was, in fact, the son of James Mill, who was at one point essentially the chief administrator, essentially like the CEO or something like that, of the East India Company. If you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, you know about the East India Company. They're like the villains. But that was a real company. And his dad was in charge of capturing Captain Jack Sparrow. That was his job. He was essentially like the CEO or chief administrator of the East India Company. So he had resources available to him. James did, and so when he raised his son, John Stuart Mill, he tried to give him the best that he had in terms of an education. Raised him as a utilitarian, as a disciple of Jeremy Bentham. John Stuart Mill was extraordinarily intelligent. So he was something like this. Don't quote me on the dates, but something like by the time that he was 3 or 4, he was already starting to learn Greek. By the time that he was 8, he was already reading Roman and Greek classics in their original language. By the time that he's a teen, he's doing stuff graduate level mathematics. He was just an extraordinary prodigy in terms of his intelligence. Again, don't quote me quite on the details, but something like that. And he wrote an autobiography. He was just an extraordinary prodigy as a child. And so growing up, he was just doing just unbelievable, unparalleled levels of work, way ahead of when he should have been doing this kind of stuff. And then, as you might expect, when he is, I believe, around the age of 20, he suffers a mental breakdown. So he said his father educated his mind, but never really educated his emotions, is what he said. As one philosopher in Shapiro describes John Stuart Mill and says he was a miserable, brilliant nerd. I'm like, yes, that's exactly right. He was a miserable, brilliant nerd. So he was always kind of like a tortured soul, and you always wonder this is maybe true of just like geniuses in general, but I think he felt kind of isolated and alienated from everybody else. That's kind of my impression of him. So there was one person who he felt like was at his level and who he understood, a woman by the name of Harriet Taylor. He met her. She's an older woman and was married when they met. Sketchy, sketchy. And they formed a kind of close friendship. And then after her husband died, under mysterious circumstances. No, I'm just kidding. That's not true. After her husband died, I think 2 years later, Mill married Harriet Taylor. So she was a mind equal to his own, and that's how he felt. And she was responsible for editing a lot of his works. And in fact, I believe it's Utilitarianism. One of those works, he says that it was right after she had passed away, and he said that the work, lacked the polish and luster that she would have been able to give it by reading it and having conversations with him about the content. So in any case, there's John Stuart Mill. So now we're going to turn and talk a little bit about the goal of utilitarianism and the methods of utilitarianism, and then move on to objections. So what is the goal of utilitarianism? I want to say that there is a sense in which the goal of utilitarianism is to invent a science of ethics. First of all, I love that phrase, there's a sense in which. It doesn't matter what you say afterwards, it always sounds like really profound, because people like connect the dots and they're like, oh yes, of course. Right? I mean, if you like say literally that Taylor Swift is the reincarnation of the author Jane Austen, people will think you're insane and try to lock you up. But if you're like, there is a sense in which Taylor Swift is like the reincarnation of Jane Austen, people will be like, oh yes, of course. Oh, that's so deep. Yes, she's like the voice of her generation. And you're like, yeah, that's what I'm like. You can just be totally bullshitting. So remember that when you're on the job market, just say there's a sense in which, and then just say a bunch of gobbledygook after that, and people will be like, yeah, right, I see what you mean, and then just let them make up a story. It's great. Anyway, okay, so there's a sense in which now you're like, great, now I know that you're bullshitting. Anyway, there's a sense in which the goal of utilitarianism is to invent a science of ethics. I think this is actually pretty straightforwardly true. Mill says in the first chapter of Utilitarianism that this is basically what he wants to do. He says ethics has been around since Aristotle or whatever. It's been around for forever, and we haven't really made much progress. So why is that? And he says, well, when philosophy gave birth to all of the natural sciences, they've done really well because they have a particular method that they know that they apply in order to settle disagreements, and that's enabled them to make a lot of discoveries. And so he says we should imitate the same thing. We need a method of ethics that enables us to settle questions about what is right or wrong. So we need a method, and that will enable us to turn ethics into a science itself. All right, so we talked a little bit about this. I'm not going to rehash all of it in our discussion about the 5 branches of philosophy, the history of philosophy, that what a science is, in large part, is an agreed-upon method for settling questions in a certain domain of inquiry, for settling disagreements. So when 2 sociologists disagree about something, they go out and do surveys. When 2 chemists disagree with one another, they blow stuff up. What do? They get into the lab, whatever. They have their own methods. Physicists have their own methods for settling disagreements. And that's part of what you learn when you study a science, is you learn the method. You learn how to settle questions in a certain domain of inquiry. And so Mill is saying we need the same thing. We need to have a method. All right? So he thinks if we have a method for settling questions in a certain domain of inquiry, then we're going to be able to settle questions, right, and have develop consensus about what is moral, what is the right way to live, what is the right way to organize society, and that kind of thing. All right? So that's the goal. What about the method? So let's remind ourselves of what utilitarianism is. It is an ethical theory that maintains that an